Tabitha had gone crazy. She had hurt Laurie, and I tried to get her off of Laurie. I tried to get Laurie out of there.
Michelle did it. Michelle. And then she kept saying, "Love you," until she was just mouthing, "Love you."
Summer, 1991. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania is home to the tranquil Amish countryside, with its horse-drawn buggies and simple living. It's a sharp contrast to the more modern suburbs nearby, creating an interesting cultural dynamic. Tourists flock to the area, drawn by the allure of Amish culture and the picturesque landscapes. While the Amish engage in traditional activities like farming and quilting, the students of Conestoga High School find their own escapes at the pool at Conestoga Pines Park or the air-conditioned local mall. Laurence, a 20-year-old lifeguard, stands out at the town pool. Tall and blonde, he looks like he belongs on Baywatch, not in the middle of Amish country. He's seen 16-year-old Laurie around. She works at the Deb shop in the mall. His ex-girlfriend Michelle shops there. But it's Laurie who catches his eye today. A tall blonde in a bikini is totally his type. Laurence decides to ask her out. But after a few dates, Laurence's true nature emerged. He had seemed so nice at first, opening up to her about his recent breakup and taking her on cute dates like to the petting zoo. Her parents thought he was too old for her, but his polite and respectful demeanor, along with getting her home on time, had eased their concerns. One night, they were supposed to meet up with her dad to go to the fair. But when they got to her dad's house, her dad and his girlfriend had already left. On the way to meet them, Laurence pulled his van over and made a move on Laurie. When she told him to stop, he didn't take no for an answer. Laurie was left traumatized and confused. Later, she discovered that Laurence's ex-girlfriend was pregnant. Wanting to avoid the drama and turmoil, Laurie chose not to say anything, hoping to get her life back to normal. But Laurie's life would just become increasingly complicated after the incident with Laurence. Michelle, Laurence's ex-girlfriend, called Laurie's mother to reveal she was pregnant. Laurie's parents were furious and forbade Laurence from ever seeing their daughter again. Michelle's anger didn't stop there. She stormed into Laurie's workplace, screaming accusations and calling her a slut. That night, Michelle called Laurie again, but this time Laurie's mother picked up the other phone and overheard the conversation. She intervened, telling Michelle to leave Laurie alone and that Laurie wanted nothing to do with Laurence. Despite trying to avoid Michelle, Laurie faced confrontations with her at the mall, leading to physical altercations. Scared and overwhelmed, Laurie confided in her parents about the assaults from Michelle and the violation by Laurence. However, she didn't want to take any action, fearing it would only make things worse. Laurie and her family tried to return to normalcy, but Michelle just wouldn't let it go. One day at the mall, Michelle confronted Laurie and her mom. Laurie's mom told Michelle what happened between Laurie and Laurence was not consensual. After that, Michelle left Laurie alone for a while. However, a few weeks later, Michelle confronted Laurie again and pushed her to the ground. Knowing Michelle was pregnant, Laurie didn't want to fight back. Instead, she tried to smooth things over. Knowing how much of a jerk Laurence was and feeling a bit sorry for Michelle, she apologized, telling Michelle she never meant to hurt her. Tabby met Michelle and Laurence through her boyfriend, and the group often hung out, driving around town together. Even after Tabby and her boyfriend broke up, she continued to spend time with Michelle and Laurence. Tabby didn't know Laurie very well, but she often heard Michelle bad-mouthing her. She told Tabby that Laurie had slept with Laurence, and that Laurie was the one who spread the rumor that their friend Laura was a lesbian. Tabby felt a little sorry for Michelle, especially since Laurence seemed indifferent to her pregnancy. The need for prenatal care, where Laurence was noticeably absent, caused Tabby and Michelle to bond. Trying to help where Laurence wouldn't, Tabby's mother even took Michelle to her doctor's appointments. On December 20th, 1991, Michelle's mom receives a call at work from the school guidance counselor. The counselor urgently needs to speak with Laurie's mom about an incident that happened outside gym class involving Laurie. With the next day being the last day of school before winter break, the counselor suggests meeting at 7 a.m. to discuss the matter, not wanting the issue to linger over the break. However, the counselor mentioned she won't be at the high school that day, as she's scheduled to be at the junior high instead. The next morning, while Laurie is getting ready for school, her mom heads to the meeting at the junior high school. When she arrives, the guidance counselor is nowhere to be found. After waiting around, Laurie's mom leaves a note for the counselor, asking her to call back, and then heads home. While Laurie's mom was at the school, Tabby and Michelle were being dropped off by Laurence down the road from Laurie's house. It was still dark out early on that winter morning as the girls snuck through the yard to Laurie's home. How they got inside remains unclear. Perhaps they knew where to find a spare key, or maybe the door was left unlocked in what was considered a safe neighborhood. Once inside, the girls crept down the hall to Laurie's room and threw open the door. Lisa Michelle Lambert grew up in the heart of Amish country, a place where traditions run deep and the community is tightly knit. Although her family wasn't Amish, they were deeply religious, adhering to strict beliefs about modesty, abstinence, and sobriety. Michelle's childhood was marked by a strict upbringing and intense religious devotion. At 15, Lisa ran away from home, dropping out of high school. The reasons for her departure were unclear, but after a year she returned home. Perhaps she was influenced by the Amish tradition of rumspringa, where teenagers explore the world outside their community. By the time she was 16, almost 17, she met Laurence, a 19-year-old with a charming demeanor and respected family background. His uncle held a significant position in the church, adding to his family's esteemed reputation. Laurence called her by her middle name, Michelle, and their initial dates were filled with romance, winning her over quickly. He took her to the movies and presented himself as the perfect gentleman. However, on their fourth date, Laurence's real character became apparent. He forced himself on her and physically assaulted her. In the eyes of her religion, Michelle felt she had no choice but to marry him, believing she was now unclean. Laurence promised to marry her, and she quickly moved in with him. To fit his ideal image, Michelle dyed her hair blonde and wore blue contact lenses, transforming herself into the Barbie doll he desired. Disobedience was met with violence, and Michelle found herself trapped in a cycle of abuse, trying to survive in a relationship that was anything but loving. Michelle wanted to go back to school, but Laurence wouldn't allow it, accusing her of wanting to flirt with other boys. Meanwhile, he was unfaithful, engaging in relationships with much younger girls and subjecting Michelle to sadistic abuse. She believed that if she could just be a better future wife, he might stop hurting her. The abuse escalated to the point where he sodomized her until she bled and beat her so severely that she leaked brain fluid from her nose. Terrified to tell her parents, Michelle covered up the bruises with makeup time after time. They moved into their own apartment and got jobs at the same restaurant so Laurence could keep an eye on her. Whenever her parents asked about her injuries, Michelle would make excuses, saying she had fallen or run into a door. The control Laurence had over her seemed unbreakable, and Michelle felt increasingly isolated and desperate. The jobs at the restaurant were only temporary, meant to cover the busy Christmas season. Once the holidays were over, Michelle found herself with no reason to leave the house, and the beatings from Laurence intensified. One day she reached her breaking point. She told Laurence she didn't love him anymore and threw the engagement ring at him, begging him to just kill her because she couldn't take it any longer. Surprisingly, Laurence accepted that she didn't want to be with him, but he insisted she couldn't move out. Michelle thought that maybe if she wasn't with him, he would have no reason to hit her, so she agreed to stay. Desperate for some freedom, Michelle began hanging out with her brother's friends, sometimes sneaking out to meet them. Laurence had gotten a job that required physical labor, so he was out most days and slept soundly at night. One evening, while skinny dipping in the creek with a boy named Alan, they saw the flashing lights of a police car. Michelle told Alan to run because she recognized the cop. His son was part of their friend group, and she didn't want Alan to get into trouble or for her brothers to find out. Michelle grabbed a sheet to cover herself and faced the officer. She had known him for a few years and had accepted rides from him in the past. The officer pressured her to drop the sheet, but she refused. He threatened to arrest her, but she called his bluff and walked back to Alan's house. Not wanting Laurence to wake up and find her gone, she didn't spend the night at Alan's. Instead, she walked home, only to be picked up by the officer. He told her she was dressed too skimpy and that he was just protecting her by giving her a ride. During the ride, he kept asking about Laurence, and Michelle ended up confiding in him. The officer then revealed his own intentions, saying he wanted to be with her, despite being old enough to be her father. Michelle rejected him. After that night, Michelle started noticing a police car parked outside her house at odd times and began receiving threatening calls during the day. She eventually got the courage to confront the officer, marching to the end of the driveway to tell him she was fine and to leave her alone. He insisted he wanted to take her on a date, and she rejected him again. Feeling more and more uncomfortable, she called the police chief and reported the harassment. The chief dismissed her concerns, saying it was an internal matter, and she heard nothing more about it. The relationship with Alan didn't last long. He started acting immaturely, trying to impress his friends and not treating Michelle with the same respect as before. One day at the pool, he pulled on her bathing suit, exposing her, and that was the final straw. She told him she didn't want to see him anymore. Angry and feeling rejected, Alan threatened to tell Laurence about their relationship. Michelle thought he wouldn't dare, knowing how violent Laurence could be, but Alan did. Michelle was at her apartment complex's pool when Laurence showed up, hurling slurs and threats at her. The lifeguards tried to protect her by locking her in the bathroom, but Laurence waited in the parking lot until the pool closed that night. When one of the lifeguards, Michael, offered to walk her home, Michelle told him to leave to protect himself. That night, Lawrence's rage reached a terrifying peak. He beat Michelle worse than ever before, cutting her with a knife. She tried to protect her face with her hands, leaving her with scars. In a final act of cruelty, Laurence killed one of her pet chinchillas, warning her that she would face the same fate if she ever stepped out of line again. One day, while Laurence was at work, Michelle heard a noise downstairs. Her heart raced as she saw a hand reaching through the broken window next to the door, trying to unlock it from the inside. Laurence had broken it before, and it was never fixed. Panic set in as she recognized the officer that had been harassing her. He was accompanied by another officer and a man in civilian clothing. They brandished a gun, and what followed was a nightmarish ordeal that Michelle would carry with her in silence. Wanting to protect Michael from the chaos and danger in her life, she explained that she could no longer meet him and their friendship had to remain a secret. The combined threat of Laurence and the officer left her more scared than ever. Seeking some semblance of normalcy, Michelle took a job at Denny's working the graveyard shift. She attributed her overwhelming fatigue to the late hours, but soon discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified to tell Laurence, fearing his reaction. Rumors began to circulate that Laurence had assaulted Laurie Show, and she might be pregnant too. Laurie started calling Michelle's house, asking for Laurence. Michelle was scared for Laurie, but also exhausted from the constant ringing during the day while she was trying to sleep. Determined to put an end to the calls, Michelle decided to visit Laurie and ask her to stop. During their conversation, Michelle revealed her pregnancy and morning sickness, pleading with Laurie not to tell Laurence. Unfortunately, the friend who drove Michelle to Laurie's house mentioned it to someone else, and the news eventually reached Laurence. Furious, he demanded to know what Laurie had said to her. Michelle insisted it was only about the phone calls. Despite this, the calls from Laurie resumed, each one more upsetting than the last. Laurie refused to speak to Michelle, and when they encountered each other at the mall, Laurie screamed that Michelle had ruined her life. In a heated moment, Laurie charged at Michelle, who, being pregnant, pushed her away, causing Laurie to fall backwards. Then finally, one night when Michelle refused Lawrence's advances, he was about to hit her, but she told him she was pregnant. His family pressured her to terminate the pregnancy, but Michelle stood her ground and refused. She would keep her baby no matter what. Laurie and her father confronted Laurence at the mall while he was with Michelle, accusing him of assaulting Laurie. A fight nearly erupted, but the girls managed to separate the men before it escalated. When they got home, Michelle asked Laurence point blank if he'd assaulted Laurie. Every time Michelle thought that Laurence's abuse couldn't get any worse, it did. This time a neighbor intervened and took Michelle to the police. Michelle was relieved that different officers were handling her case, but she was too frightened to press charges. The police still documented her injuries with a report and photographs. She knew that Laurence's family lawyer would likely get him off, and pressing charges would only endanger her and her unborn child further. Determined to escape, Michelle began saving all of her tips, hiding the money in a secret spot. She was planning to leave and never return, but she had to be patient and plan carefully. The police began calling the house, asking for Laurence. Michelle would always say he was at work and quickly hang up. Due to her distrust of the police from past experiences, she eventually started ignoring the phone altogether. Meanwhile, the landlord started coming around because Laurence wasn't paying the rent. This led to an abrupt move to a remote trailer home on a large property outside of town. During the move, Laurence discovered Michelle's secret stash of money. She knew that any action that angered him could put her baby's life at risk, so she had to comply with his demands. She went wherever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Michelle met Tabby while hanging out with Laurence's friends. Tabby was going through a breakup, and Michelle went over to comfort her. Desperate for a friend, Michelle maintained contact with Tabby whenever she could, despite Laurence not hooking up the phone. There was another confrontation with Laurie. When Laurie approached Michelle aggressively, Michelle, trying to protect her baby and avoid a fight, pushed her away. Laurie fell backwards and hit her head on the tailgate of a truck. Laurence bragged about the so-called fight, but Michelle just wanted to forget the incident. She was tired of the violence and wanted to avoid any more conflict, having already endured enough with Laurence. Laurence's threats escalated. He threatened her, he threatened the baby, and he even cut up the baby clothes she had received. He also threatened to kill her cat. In public, Michelle felt she couldn't speak out against him. When asked about the fight and the charges Laurie's parents were trying to press, she defended Laurence. Determined to escape, Michelle planned her getaway once more. She decided to return all the Christmas presents she had received from Laurence's family, asking for cash instead. She intended to take the money and leave forever. Laurence was desperate to silence Laurie, fearing a conviction for the assault that could land him in prison for up to 10 years. He and Tabby devised a plan to harm Laurie, which horrified Michelle. She pleaded with them, suggesting they shouldn't hurt Laurie, especially since she had heard Laurie might be pregnant. Instead, Michelle proposed they do something less violent, like cutting Laurie's hair to humiliate her. She packed a pair of scissors into a backpack, hoping to steer the plan away from violence. On December 21st, 1991, they woke early and prepared to execute their plan. However, Laurence had secretly replaced the scissors in the backpack with a knife. When they picked up Tabby, she found the knife but no scissors. Assuming the knife could be used to cut hair, and with daylight approaching, they decided to proceed. Laurence dropped them off, claiming he needed to get a drink from McDonald's because his asthma was acting up. As the girls reached the landing on the stairs at Laurie's house, Michelle stopped and said she would wait there for Laurence to return. Tabby continued up the stairs to confront Laurie. At this point, we've explored the events leading up to December 21st, 1991, from both Michelle and Laurie's perspective. It's important to note that Michelle detailed her version of events in her autobiography, where she outlines her claims about what transpired. However, Laurie's mother has a very different account of the events, and she later became a strong advocate for tougher stalking laws in Pennsylvania. Michelle's claims, as presented in her book, are her own words and reflect her perspective on the situation. In contrast, Laurie's mother provides a different narrative, emphasizing the need for justice and stronger protections against stalking. When Laurie's mother Hazel arrived home, a neighbor intercepted her, mentioning loud noises coming from her apartment earlier. Alarmed, Hazel rushed inside. At first, everything seemed normal, and the quietness led her to believe that Laurie had already left for school. However, when she peeked into Laurie's room, she was confronted with a horrific scene. Laurie was on the floor, bleeding profusely and wheezing with a cord tied around her neck. Hazel quickly grabbed something to cut the cord away, and when she did, it revealed the horrible wound to Laurie's neck. She held her daughter close and asked her who did this to her. With her last breath, she told her mother, "Michelle did it." When Laurie's father, John, received the devastating news, he was overwhelmed with grief and fury. He yelled at the police, accusing them of failing to protect Laurie, despite knowing that Michelle had been harassing her. Laurie's mother told the police Laurie's last words. It was Michelle who was responsible. The police gathered evidence from the scene and took statements from neighbors who reported seeing two people in dark hoodies in the area. The police found the trio at a local bowling alley and promptly arrested Michelle and Laurence. Initially, they didn't suspect Tabby until they noticed a pretty large cut on her face. They detained her and took her to the station for questioning, with her mother present since she was under 18. Michelle and Laurence were transported and questioned separately. All three of them recounted an identical yet convoluted story about their morning. They claimed they had gone to a Kmart where Tabby accidentally left her bag. Then they had car trouble and had to pull over at a McDonald's. According to their story, two Hispanic girls approached them, started harassing them, called them names, and slapped Michelle. Tabby stepped in to defend her pregnant friend and got scratched in the face with keys. They said then they stopped at a gas station to fill up one of the tires with air before dropping Tabby off at school at 9 a.m. The police then released Tabby at that point, though they were not convinced she was being truthful. The police questioned Michelle about her relationship with Laurie, initially framing it as an inquiry into one of the fights with Laurie that her parents were pressing charges for. Michelle recounted several altercations in her statements.
A couple of times I called, there were problems. I was pregnant and I just wanted to basically leave everything alone.
She mentioned an incident at the mall where she pushed Laurie into a store window, and another where she grabbed Laurie by the hair. During that confrontation, Laurie attempted to kick Michelle in the stomach, prompting Michelle to push her down. Michelle insisted that she hadn't seen Laurie since November and that things had calmed down since then. The police informed Michelle that Laurie was dead and that they suspected her involvement. Despite her denials, they expressed disbelief. Michelle's statements began to shift. Initially, she claimed she was there but hadn't gone inside. Then she admitted to being inside but insisted she didn't see anything. Eventually, she said she saw what happened but tried to help Laurie. Throughout, she maintained that Laurence wasn't involved, stating that he only drove them there. Laurence, on the other hand, started talking immediately. He placed the blame squarely on Michelle and Tabby, claiming he didn't know their plan and only realized something terrible had happened when he picked them up and saw blood on their clothes. He told the police he helped the girls dispose of the bloody clothes and offered to show them where. Although the police didn't have enough evidence yet to charge them with murder, they wanted to keep them in custody, so they charged Michelle and Laurence with petty offenses and transported them to jail, awaiting the autopsy and other results from the crime scene. The next day, the police were able to retrieve the bloody clothing, which corroborated Laurence's story. The autopsy revealed that the fatal wound was the neck injury, but Laurie had also sustained numerous defensive wounds. With this evidence, the police arrested Tabby and charged both her and Michelle with first-degree murder. Laurence was charged with obstruction, but the judge set Lawrence's bail at $1 million. Tabby was going to be tried as an adult, and Michelle, who was 7 months pregnant, was the last to be led from the courthouse back to jail to await trial. Michelle waived her right to a jury, opting instead for a bench trial. She would be the first to face the court among the three accused. During the trial, Laurence testified against Michelle, claiming she was always jealous of Laurie. He recounted that on the day of the incident, he believed Tabby and Michelle were only going to scare Laurie. They had instructed him to drop them off and return in 30 minutes. When he came back, they weren't there, so he circled the area a few times before finally finding them down the road. They refused to tell him what had happened, but he noticed the blood and that Tabby had scratches and Michelle had bruises on her hand. Later, when Laurence asked Michelle again about what had transpired, she told him they had been wrestling with the knife, which accidentally stabbed Laurie in the back, puncturing her lung. Michelle mentioned that Tabby wanted to, quote, slit her throat and put her out of her misery, but she didn't confirm if they actually did that. Then they went to a laundromat to wash their clothes, and Michelle insisted on discarding some of the freshly washed items. Afterward, they met up with Tabby again and concocted their alibi together. Michelle's defense team aimed to cast doubt on Laurence's claims of non-involvement. They questioned him about whether he had abused Michelle. They highlighted his possible motive. Laurie's parents wanted legal action taken for the assault on Laurie. They brought up the various types of earrings Laurence liked to wear. They later highlighted that Laurence's earring backs were found at the crime scene, but were not included in the evidence. The defense also introduced a document that would come to be known as the 29-question document. Before the trial, Michelle said that she and Laurence would exchange letters and meet in the jail's library. During these meetings, Laurence would belittle her, telling her how ugly she looked without lipstick, how he disliked her hair and brown eyes, and that she was getting fat. These comments likely reinforced his control over her, keeping her intimidated and submissive. Michelle claims that Laurence was sharing Michelle's letters with his lawyer, seemingly aware that she was sticking to her story and taking the blame for him. Michelle, on the other hand, did not inform her lawyer about the letters she received from Laurence. In these letters, Laurence hinted that she might face the death penalty, which Michelle perceived as a threat. Her fate, whether she lived or died, seemed to depend on his testimony. Laurence assured her that he would get out on bail and be at the hospital when she gave birth. He also threatened that his parents were willing to fight for custody of the baby. Michelle's lawyer was growing increasingly frustrated. He knew that Laurence would betray Michelle to save himself, yet she continued to protect him. In a final, desperate attempt to reach out, Michelle wrote to Laurence one last time. When she received a reply, she handed it over to her lawyer, finally allowing him a glimpse into the twisted dynamics of their relationship. In the letter, she asked questions like, "Will you promise to love me if I lie for you?" and got the answer, "always and forever." She wrote, "Do you remember seeing Laurie dead?" Answer, "Yes, I remember seeing dead." But something was scribbled out and unreadable. The answer wouldn't make sense, unless it originally read, "Yes, I remember seeing Laurie dead." During the trial, Michelle's defense team questioned Laurence about the answers he had provided. Laurence claimed that the questions had been altered. While he admitted to writing the answers, he insisted that the questions were not the same ones he had originally responded to. He also denied ever telling Michelle that, because she was pregnant and a woman, she would receive a lighter sentence than he would. The defense further argued that Laurie could not have spoken after sustaining her neck wound, as the injury would have likely damaged her windpipe and vocal cords. Additionally, they pointed out that the tip of the supposed murder weapon was broken, which would have required significant force. Force, they argued, Michelle was unlikely to have been able to exert. The defense pointed out that the one thing in Michelle's statements to the police that had never changed, she had always implicated Tabby, not herself or Laurence. The police officers who examined Michelle upon her arrest did not observe any injuries on her, unlike Tabby and Laurence, who both had visible cuts and scratches. Furthermore, none of Michelle's blood or hair was found at the crime scene. The defense called a forensic handwriting expert to testify. He stated that the scribbled-out word in Laurence's answer was Laurie. The expert also noted that the letter was written in both pencil by Michelle and pen by Laurence. He asserted that the document had not been altered, contradicting Laurence's claims. However, the expert's credibility might have come into question during his testimony. He repeatedly mispronounced Laurence's name, referring to him as Mr. Lumpkin instead of Mr. Yunkin, which may have undermined his authority in the eyes of the judge. And later, in her autobiography, Michelle would contradict the expert opinion, stating that the expert had never found any pencil marks on the document at all, presenting this as her proof that the document had not been altered because it was all in ink. The defense also called the officer who had processed the crime scene photos. He testified that he noticed what appeared to be a clear message written on the closet door in blood, the letters T and B. This could have referred to Tabby Buck, or possibly Tabby and Butch, which was Laurence's nickname. Michelle was also called to the stand. She admitted that she had gotten into altercations with Laurie a few times and was angry at her for sleeping with her boyfriend. Michelle stated that Tabby had told her she was the one who made the call to get Laurie's mother out of the house. She also mentioned that Laurence had expressed a desire to hurt Laurie because he feared going to jail for the assault. Michelle had heard a rumor that Laurie was pregnant and proposed a less violent solution, cutting Laurie's hair. They had all agreed to this plan. In her testimony, Michelle described her actions on the day of the incident. She had waited on the landing outside the apartment door. When she heard the door slam, she went inside and saw Tabby and Laurie struggling in the hallway. Laurie fled into her bedroom with Tabby in pursuit, appearing frenzied. Michelle tried to pull Laurie away from Tabby, and that's when Tabby stabbed Laurie. Michelle said she tried to help Laurie up and get her to the door, but Tabby grabbed Laurie and pulled her back into the bedroom. At that moment, Laurence showed up, brought Michelle down to the landing again, and ran back into the apartment. Michelle heard loud yelling from Tabby, Laurence, and Laurie. Eventually, Tabby and Laurence came back down, and they all left and went to Michelle and Laurence's house. Michelle overheard Tabby saying that Laurence had choked Laurie, while Laurence claimed that Tabby had stabbed her. They argued about whose fault it was, and then concocted the story about how Tabby got cut before taking her to school. Michelle testified that Laurence had asked her to take the blame, convincing her that she would receive a lighter sentence because she was a woman and pregnant. He argued that if he went to jail for life, there would be no one to take care of their baby. She genuinely believed his assurances. Michelle stated that after the incident, they washed their clothes and then disposed of some items in a dumpster and others near the river. They then met up with Tabby to finalize their story and, disturbingly, Tabby and Laurence sang Ding Dong the Witch is Dead. Afterward, they went to a bowling alley where they were eventually arrested. She said Laurence insisted they needed to act normal and do everyday activities to avoid suspicion. The prosecution aimed to dismantle the defense's case by poking holes in the 29 questions document. They argued that the questions were inconsistent and the answers vague, suggesting it was a form of entrapment after the fact. Laurie's mother, Hazel, provided emotional testimony, recounting Laurie's final words, "Michelle did it." The prosecution also presented the autopsy results and their own experts' testimony, which indicated that it was possible for Laurie to have spoken or whispered despite her injuries. They highlighted the numerous times Michelle had changed her story, pointing out her inconsistencies and lies. The prosecution argued that Michelle wasn't protecting Laurence, she was protecting herself. Michelle's lawyer moved for a mistrial, arguing that the DA had suppressed evidence. However, the judge denied the motion. The defense aimed to plant reasonable doubt in the judge's mind. They emphasized that Michelle was a high school dropout, yet she had supposedly fooled 2 handwriting experts. Laurence had admitted to striking Michelle, yet the prosecution portrayed her as the dominant one in the relationship. The defense argued that the prosecution was so focused on Michelle that they were ignoring other possibilities. They insisted that Michelle never intended to harm Laurie and that this wasn't a case of first-degree premeditated murder. The prosecution countered by pointing out that one doesn't have to be the actual murderer to be guilty. Under the felony murder rule, anyone involved in the commission of a felony that results in murder can be held responsible. They highlighted that Michelle had told Laurie she wanted to kill her, and that this wasn't just a figure of speech. It was a threat, a warning, or even a promise. They argued that Michelle was obsessed with Laurie. The prosecution found it unbelievable and disturbing that Michelle wanted to shift from being seen as a victim to a savior. The judge would find Lisa Michelle Lambert guilty of first-degree murder. During the sentencing phase, her family pleaded for mercy. A psychologist testified that Michelle was not a disturbed person or a psychopath, but rather a victim of abuse. Friends and acquaintances described her as shy and sensitive. They also highlighted that she was the mother of a 4-month-old baby. Michelle made a statement expressing remorse for what had happened, while maintaining her innocence and uninvolvement in the crime. Despite this, the prosecution pushed for the death penalty, emphasizing the savagery of the crime. Ultimately, Michelle was sentenced to life in prison. Tabitha Buck, relatively unknown in Lancaster County and only 17 years old, faced her trial next. Due to concerns about jury bias, her trial was moved to another county. Her defense team argued that Laurence was a liar who had managed to escape a harsher punishment by striking a favorable deal. Obstruction could result in only 3 to 7 years in prison. At that time, Laurence had cut a deal to plead to a lesser charge and testify at both trials. Tabby's defense emphasized that her blood wasn't found at the crime scene and that she had never been involved in any of the previous altercations between Laurie and Michelle. While Laurie had identified Michelle as her attacker, the defense didn't question whether Laurie could speak after her injury. Instead, they underscored that she could, making her dying words credible. The prosecution, now pursuing second-degree murder charges, argued that Tabitha was equally culpable. They pointed out that under Pennsylvania law, second-degree murder occurs when a homicide is committed during the perpetration of a felony, even if the defendant was only an accomplice. The jury would find Tabitha Buck guilty of second-degree murder, and she received a life sentence for her role in the crime. Despite Laurence's deal, the damage was done. His agreement was revoked, and he ultimately pleaded no contest to third-degree murder, receiving a sentence of 10 to 20 years for his role in the crime. Laurence was released on parole in 2004 after serving 12 years in prison. In a significant legal development, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama in 2012 that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles are unconstitutional. This decision was later applied retroactively in Montgomery v. Louisiana in 2016. This allowed individuals previously sentenced to life without parole as juveniles to seek resentencing. Tabitha Buck benefited from this ruling. Initially sentenced to life without parole, she was resentenced to 28 years to life in November 2017. Tabitha was granted parole and released from prison on December 21, 2019, after serving nearly 28 years.
She was resentenced after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that life sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. The Pennsylvania Board of Probation and Parole granted Buck parole on or after December 21st, a day after the murder in 1991. The board cited her positive institutional behavior, demonstrated motivation for success, and stated remorse for the offense committed, among other things.
Lisa Michelle Lambert's conviction was actually overturned on appeal in 1997. A federal judge ruled that Lambert had been denied a fair trial due to the prosecution's misconduct and ineffective assistance of counsel. However, this decision was short-lived. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the ruling in 1998. The court found that Lambert's claims needed to be addressed through the Pennsylvania state courts first. She had not exhausted all of her state court remedies before seeking federal relief. This procedural misstep led to the reinstatement of her original conviction and sentence, and she was to return to prison to continue serving her life sentence. Only a heartfelt plea from Lisa's daughter stopped her from taking her own life, rather than returning to prison. This plea gave Lisa the strength to start the process of her many appeals. During her subsequent appeals, Lisa made several claims. She alleged that the assault by the group of police officers made them focus on her as the main perpetrator in the crime, and that this was used to cover up for their misconduct. One of the men she accused was on his honeymoon on the date she alleged the incident occurred. Her appeals centered on this accusation, the suppression of physical evidence, and evidence that Laurence was abusing her. However, Tabitha testified against Lisa, further implicating her. Lisa also accused prison guards of non-consensual incidents, though others believed that these interactions were mutual. Regardless, prisoners cannot legally consent, so the guard was prosecuted and convicted. In her autobiography, Lisa outlined her belief that there was corruption in her case. She made claims that she never stalked Laurie, didn't hate her, and was unfairly targeted. Lisa's legal battles continued as she attempted to appeal her case all the way up to the Supreme Court. However, in 2005, the Supreme Court refused to hear her case. After the tragic murder of her daughter, Hazel became a tireless advocate for stronger anti-stalking laws in Pennsylvania. She campaigned vigorously, highlighting the gaps in the legal system that allowed her daughter's stalkers to harass her without consequence. Hazel's efforts were instrumental in the enactment of new anti-stalking legislation in 1993. Her advocacy not only honored Laurie's memory, but also aimed to protect others from similar fates, ensuring that stalking victims would have better legal protections in the future. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. How significant do you think the impact of psychological manipulation and abuse was, and does it make Lisa Michelle Lambert another victim in this story? What are your views on how the legal system should balance the need for justice with the potential for rehabilitation, especially for juveniles? And what do you think about the use of plea deals in cases where multiple people are involved but have different levels of participation? Feel free to share your opinions in the comments below. Also, if you have any case suggestions you'd like me to cover in future episodes, let me know. Remember, every wrinkle tells a story, and in the wrinkles of crime, we find the truth. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing. I'd love to hear your opinions or suggestions in the comments. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next video, and we'll explore another story hidden within the wrinkles in crime.